And our presenter today is Dr. Mica McMillan. She is an assistant professor in horticulture, University of Florida Environmental Horticulture Department, and she focuses on palm horticulture. She has degrees from UF and Auburn. She works mostly with palms, but her focus is on improving the growing environment of palms and other ornamentals by studying plant stress and the rhizosphere, which is the root zone area, and looking for plant response to amendments. And so her main focus is truly plant health. And she has a wealth of knowledge on palms, but she has a lot of other interests as well. So, Mica, welcome to the Master Gardener webinar. We're thrilled that you're here. I'm going to invite you to share. There's only 412 people. I'm sorry we couldn't have had a bigger group, but we'll keep working on it. I'm sure some other people will come on in.
Geez,
So
that's it. Gosh, come on.
you're welcome to share. All right,
Okay. You see it, Wendy?
we don't see the full slide view yet.
Okay, let's do this. Can you see it now, Wendy?
Not yet. There we go. We got it now.
Okay. Thank you, Wendy, very much for this invite. And I will tell you a little bit about how this got started. So I have a background in soil and water science. And for 20 years, I worked in the industry and we evaluated materials, particularly for peat substrates. And these materials would be like surfactants or amendments to improve the wettability of peat. So I've been studying peatlands for quite some time. But when I started here at UF, I was talking to Liz Felter and she's like, oh my gosh, you have a background in peat. And I was like, yes. And so we were able to uh, obtain a grant, a CDIC grant, where we were looking at CNAF as a potential alternative to peat, using it as a compost. So kind of got me back into this world, which I absolutely love. But today I want to talk to you about the alternatives to peat and what are some of the things that are good about them? What are some of the drawbacks? And I also want to talk about how important peat is to our horticultural industry. So why are we looking at these alternatives? Number one, if your peat comes from Canada, then absolutely you're going to be paying very high shipping costs right now. And when we had started to evaluate different substrates 3 years ago, it was towards the end of the pandemic. And so the cost for peat was extremely high. In fact, core was actually a little bit cheaper than peat. So I think a lot of my growers were turning to core. I had a lot of growers calling me and asking me if I had a supply of peat. So that was very important. Shipping cost is a big one for my growers. Also, with peat and peatlands and obtaining the material and being able to access that material, if there's a lot of rain in Canada, there is no harvesting of the peat. So peat shortages are very dependent, or peat in itself, the peat supply is very dependent on precipitation up in Canada. So we also have a lot of new crops. So we're not always looking for very acidic substrates. We're also not looking for sometimes very alkaline substrates. It's all very dependent on the plant. There's been a lot of interest in one, CNAF or cannabis and orchids. So they all take a little bit different uh, uh, type of substrate preference, particularly with regards to pH and physical properties. So we're not always going to be relying on peat. And of course, my growers are very interested in reducing water and fertilizer usage. I know a lot of our stakeholders and our master gardeners are interested in not watering as much and not using as much fertilizer. So that's why we're looking at these alternatives. But we have to address the fact that by 2050, we're looking at a four-fold increase in the amount of soilless media we will need to maintain the horticulture industry, vegetable crop, some crop industries. And this is a cold, hard fact that we need to start addressing right now. So that's why we've opened this up to a lot of different alternatives for our substrates. And keep in mind, how much potting media do we really use? And when I'm talking about potting media, I'm meaning peat. We use about 70 million cubic yards that were consumed in 2019. So that number's from 2019, and it's projected to increase fourfold to 280 million cubic meters by 2050. So that's just looking at peat. So here in Florida, it's critical, right? I think we're all very aware, particularly if you work at the University of Florida and you're a master gardener or volunteer, you absolutely know that our nursery and landscape industry is mega. It's worth 30 billion to the Florida economy. It provides over 609 million in local and state tax revenue, so big bucks. And the industry just from 2018 grew substantially, more than 23%. And particularly during COVID, where we were all growing, we were all planting, and we established backyard gardens, we saw a sharp increase during that time period as well. And most importantly, it creates over 260,000 jobs. So jobs are a big one for this industry. I was just at the TPIE, or the Tropical Plant International Expo here in Fort Lauderdale, and it's just gotten bigger and bigger. It's just massive. So definitely important to the state of Florida. And as we're looking at these alternatives to peat, we also know that listen, I've been studying this issue for over 20 years, and it's never been the right time to hit it, right? But now we're starting to see where there's a global purchase behavior, meaning that a lot of more people are looking to shift towards something other than peat because they know the importance of the peatlands. So we see a trend of 85% are more likely to switch to something sustainable over the past, or have shifted to something more sustainable over the past 5 years. So now is the time to do it. And we've been doing this for a while, for probably 5, 10 years, and trying to move more of our growers to a more sustainable alternative. However, I just conducted a survey where we found that, this is for potentially for our growers. A lot of the extension agents helped me with this one, but what we found was that most of our growers are still utilize peat, and the number one reason they utilize peat is for the drainage purposes. So definitely still important here in Florida. So for my nursery growers, what's their main issue? Of course, the cost of shipping peat or core. And remember, core is another big one. Cocoa core, some people call it coconut core, but that is also shipped from South America, Indonesia, Australia. So they are really, of course, going to still have to pay the shipping cost. But additionally, we have to keep in mind that there are also some human rights issues associated with cocoa core that we need to at some point address sooner rather than later. We know that there are supply chain issues, definitely, like we talked about why peat can sometimes be hard to get hold of, but supply chain issues as well with core. When I first started looking at horticultural substrates years ago, I could get core for free. When I started here at UF, I was looking to buy a pallet of core, and it was $5,000. So the cost had gone up substantially because we were towards the end of COVID, and they knew that people needed the soil as substrate. We know also a big issue is that some of these soil as substrates cost way more than peat. So that is an issue for my growers. I've talked to them about compost. I've talked to them about, rice holes or something that we could access locally, and they're all for it. But sometimes they get into where, yes, I'll take the compost, I'll take the rice holes, but then over time that cost starts to increase, and they say, well, I can just go back to peat because sometimes it can be a lot cheaper. And of course, we all know that we're trying to avoid the overwatering. We're trying to avoid over fertilizing, and a lot of that has to do with if you do turn to something else like a compost or a rice hole, you are going to have to compensate for the peat. So these are just issues that are specifically focused on growers, and I know a lot of the stakeholders, I know a lot of master gardeners also have the same issue. So what makes peat so unique? And what are we looking for specifically in a growing media? So When I talk to growers, they know the definitions of all of these. When I'm talking to master gardener volunteers, absolutely, they know what this is. But when I'm talking to the majority of stakeholders, um, they have a hard time, understanding what some of these properties are. We know bulk density is important, and that has to go along with the airfield porosity and the media stability. So these are physical properties that we're absolutely interested in maintaining, that some of our other alternative substrates just don't have that perfect uh, range that we're looking for. Cation exchange capacity, one of the biggest issues with some of our alternative substrates is they don't have a high cation exchange capacity or the ability to hold on to nutrients. So when I'm talking about cations, peat is one of the highest. When we talk about golf courses, they use a 90-10 sand peat blend or an 80-20. Why? Because they add in just enough of that peat to increase their water holding capacity, their cation exchange capacity, and that helps to make the play nice and even, particularly on the greens. So CEC is a big one for my growers as well. The pH, our optimum range for pH and horticultural substrate mix has grown. It used to be, the range used to be okay, about 6 to 7, right around in there. But because we're growing so many different varieties of plants that have different pH needs, I've seen that range go from as low as 5, up to 7 or 8. So pH is a big one, and it all depends on what you're growing. EC also, we're doing a lot of testing with certain substrates, and we're seeing where the ECs are extremely high. So we want to try to make sure that those ECs are between 2 and 3. But again, it's very dependent on the plant. The other issue is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. We want to make sure that the microbes are not going to be eating away at all the fertilizer, and we want to make sure that we're not immobilizing some of the nutrients. So carbon to nitrogen ratio, what we typically say is between 20 and 30 is always optimum.
Hey, Mike, I'm gonna pop in. We had a couple questions for clarity. I hope it doesn't throw off your jam here. Because I think it has to do with this slide and talking about the distinction between peat moss and sphagnum moss, if you could speak to that a little bit. And then I think you might need to talk about EC a little bit more. That's a little bit more advanced than we normally talk about. I think people more on the coastal side understand EC, but maybe more interior folks don't as much. So if you could break that vernacular down for us, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the EC, or the electrical conductivity, is what we evaluate here at the research station and in the lab. And we use certain meters to tell us in the substrates or in the water what our electrical conductivity, or what, and I hear this used interchangeably, but the salt content. And EC, though, does include sodium, but it also includes some of our other salts that can be found in our water and our soils and our substrates. So when I say that we want an EC between 2 and 3, we that's a very low EC. That means it doesn't have a lot of sodium on there. So we're making sure that there's not a lot of salt or basically sodium on there, or within that water. And so as you start to mix salt water into water or effluent water, sometimes we see those EC ranges go a little bit higher. 4, 5, 6. I've seen as high as, we're doing some other high salinity research projects. We can get up there to 8 decisiemens per meter. So it can be very high. But for our specific needs in horticulture, we say between 2 and 3. And of course, there are some plants that can tolerate much higher ranges, and there are some plants that cannot. So it depends on what you're growing. And this is very important when I'm talking in a general, and you would have to specifically say, hey, for blueberries, they don't tolerate salinity very well, or a high EC. So when you get your soil or water report, EC is one of the ones that you should, will say electrical conductivity, typically in decisiemens per meter, and should range between 2 and 3. Sometimes it could be a little bit higher. I've seen 4. and the plants don't seem to mind that as well. The other question was the difference between a peat moss or a sphagnum moss. There are many different types of peat out there. And for this particular presentation, I'm going to be focusing on sphagnum peat moss because this is basically what we're shipping from Canada. Now, I know that some of my growers, I personally have a preference for Dakota. And I say this because that's the brand. I'm not trying to say that this is, we're not saying to buy Dakota, but Dakota is a reed sedge peat. And there's also a hypnum peat moss that you can find. Generally, we purchase a hypnum peat moss uh, from Montana, but there are different types of peat, and it's all what was growing on top of that bog or fen at the time. So specifically for this one, though, I'm talking about the Canadian sphagnum peat moss. Okay. And keep coming with the questions. It doesn't get me off my game. I don't mind being interrupted. Okay, and then the peat is our premium substrate. That's what my growers say. This is the top dog. They're willing to pay a little bit more for it. Why? Because it has a low pH typically. We know that if you're pulling peat from a bog, it's typically going to be a very low pH, like 3 or 4. When I've evaluated different types of peat from around the world, we've seen where that range can be anywhere from 3 to 7. Me personally, what we love about peat is it has a very high cation exchange capacity. A lot of that organic matter is right there. So we are able to hold on to nutrients. And sometimes, depending on the peat, the source, the location of the harvesting, what the nutrients are and what's available to the plant, it can also be very beneficial for the growing environment. We know that peat, like I said, it has a ability to hold moisture and also to drain. So it's an air-filled porosity, and it makes it very important to our growers because they don't want to hold water so that it doesn't drain. And remember, I told you that the number one issue and why they use peat is because of drainage. So they don't want to hold water because it leads to diseases, and particularly root diseases. But also we want to have a little bit of moisture holding capacity. We don't want to be pouring it into sand, so to speak, and just having the water run through. We also know that there are a lot of beneficial aspects of peat leading to the resistance to diseases. So we see sometimes the plants are just not as prone to diseases when they're planted in a peat or what we consider the premium substrate. However, there are problems that are associated with the harvesting of peat. Why? Because our peatlands are one of the largest natural terrestrial carbon store in the world. And we know that they store more carbon than anything else. We also know that, yes, you're going to be paying more for it, the issue with the transpiration, the supply. But we are seeing that there are a lot of issues across the world where um, Canada has only been harvesting peat for the last 100 years, but in Europe, they've been harvesting peat for thousands. Okay, and in Europe, they have also used peat as a fuel source. And here for Canada, particularly for the Canadian sphagnum peat moss, they're just specifically focused on the horticultural market. So please keep that in mind when I'm talking about how important these are environmentally, because they do store a ton of carbon. Yes, there's a lot of different vegetation and a lot of different plants on these peatlands that you won't find anywhere else. There are definitely some issues associated with harvesting from the peatland that just don't have to do with what growers want and all the costs and whatnot. It also has to be because of the environmental issues. So we're focusing on Canada, and these are the Canadian peatlands. And you can see here in the green the different types of peats. And they have in Canada over 120 million hectares of peatlands. They contain 25% of the global peatlands in the world, obviously, and then followed by Russia. and I believe Finland is third. So these typically what we're pulling for horticultural substrates tend to be in these northern climates. But for Canada right now, they are looking at 25% of the global peatlands. And to the right, you can see how widespread that is through Canada. Now, yesterday, I've been talking to this Canadian Sphagnum Peat Moss Association, the CSPMA, and Asha Hingorani, as well as Stephanie Boudreau, came down and they gave a talk on the sustainability of peat. And I've been talking to them for a while, and I was very excited to see them down here to give this presentation about how we are starting to look at it. Peat's taken a big hit over the last few years, and probably the last 20 years, where we do know that we need to keep the peatlands and make sure that they're being restored and reclaimed. Um, and I know that James Altland from the USDA is doing a lot of work on, um, you know, he has already established, yes, we do believe that is a sustainable. But when you type in peatlands and restoration and you type it into Google, you'll see that the first thing they say is, the sustainability of peat and all the issues associated with it. But we're working with, and talking to CSPMA, and they can tell you that for Canada, they're utilizing 0.03% of Canada's peatlands, which is about 36,000 hectare per total footprint. And they are doing this environmentally and responsibly. So going through this SCS managed peatlands program, or what we call Veriflora. So all the peatlands in Canada, 88% of them are certified to maintain, restore, and reclaim their peatlands. So the graph you're looking at here is that out of that 36,000 hectares, the restored and reclaim is 21%, and then the unrestored is what they haven't accomplished it yet, but it's what I'm going to uh, it's how do I say this? The restored and reclaimed are it should be definitely be in the gray. Sorry about that. So there's much more that have been restored and reclaimed, and the unrestored, they're working on that, but it's still about 11%. But they are getting back to where they're restoring their peatlands. And like I said, we're not using this for energy production. They're not going to be shipping for energy production. There's no interest in Canada to use it for such. And the reason why it's such a big issue in Europe, again, is because they had been using it for thousands of years. So the other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about peatlands, and it's all the jobs that, harvesting the peatland from these bog areas, they do create rural jobs, and particularly in these very rural communities. So something to think about. So if you go to a box store, a Lowe's and whatnot, and you still, you love peat and you want to continue to use it, if you see this sign right here, and I actually learned this yesterday. This is what they call the Veriflora certification, and it's a kingfisher on there. And if your peat bag has it on there, that means that whoever they harvested the peat from is growing it sustainably, and they are looking to restore that peatland. So that's what the symbol is that you want to be looking for. And how do we do these bog restorations? We basically look at they're utilizing a moss layer transfer technique that has absolutely been wonderful in helping the plants to reestablish. So in a bog restoration, we're looking to 3 to 5 years of plant reestablishment. The biodiversity returns in a very high level. The return of the carbon sink timeline is about 10 to 15 years. I know that online, some of it's reported for hundreds of years. Well, they now know, because they've done a lot of research, that it's really more 10 to 15 years. The hydrology is back on the path to recovery. And right now they have 70% of the horticultural peat industry post-production areas have been restored or reclaimed. So this is all very good news. I like to hear this. And the moss layer transfer technique, or MLT technique, is now being utilized in Europe, and they are seeing where it's helping to recover some of their peatlands as well, which is a very positive thing. So it's a little bit of how they're doing it, why it's important, and you take this research that they have done and you take it from what you have seen on the internet, which sometimes can be at odds with what we know based on research. Okay.
Great. So Micah, there's a couple questions on the peat, and someone wanting you to break down the kind of the difference between reclaimed and restored peat fields. And then also, we know that peat is, this giant carbon sink, which is fabulous, but is climate change affecting the bogs as they are? And I don't know if you know that answer, but I'm just throwing that out there.
I that's a really hard that's a really hard question. Um, so it, it, de- I guess it depends on how you want to look at it. I have been looking at this situation for 20 years, and uh, we now know, yes, these peatlands are major carbon sinks, and we want to maintain either way. Even if they weren't major carbon sinks, we'd still want to maintain them, because they do have a lot of different, wildlife. Their plants in themselves are just so unique. So we want to keep some of these pristine and able, for 100 years that somebody can go back and revisit these. So um, for me, I think they they are doing this sustainably. And I've talked enough to and seen the presentations to know that some of the best people up in Canada are working on it, and they are absolutely doing a fantastic job of really researching this. Um, I don't know, and I am not going to answer that question about the global, climate change. I don't know. Um, and I don't know if I think in 100 years we'll know. So I just think they're important enough to maintain and restore. The difference between restoring and
Reclaiming.
reclaim, thank you. So restored is they are putting them back the way they found them, and reclaimed is, and I'm hoping I'm getting this. Reclaimed is these are bogs that were left, and now they're going back in after a certain period of time and uh, restoring them, so to speak. So you've got reclaimed where they have been left for a while, and then you go back in to restore.
I see. Okay, great. Thank you for that.
Yes. Um, Good question. But so now we've talked a little bit about peat, and I normally say that spiel for the end because I've had a number of people tell me, like, I've given this presentation and they've said, well, um, you're looking for alternatives to peat because you don't believe peat is sustainable. No, I moved that to the front of the presentation because I do believe the way it's being done now. Yes, and they have found a technique that is absolutely working, which is wonderful. So yes, now I can say and that I do believe it is being done sustainably and it is sustainable practice. Now, perlite, on the other hand, is a volcanic obsidian, a volcanic glass. It's obsidian, but I know every person on this on this presentation knows exactly what perlite is. But we also know that it's not sustainable, so we are looking for alternatives for that as well. It does a fantastic job of aiding drainage, root developments. The roots are crazy when there's perlite in the amendment or your substrate. It's lovely because it's pH neutral. Um, and there is some, you know, uh, research that suggests it may help prevent disease, and that has to do with aiding drainage. And of course, it's very long lasting. So, if you go out there in a year, you're probably going to still see perlite still in your beds or in your container plants. But again, we go back to this is not sustainable. So when we talk about, it's not only peat that we're worried about, but also, or that we should looking for an alternative, but also perlite. So like we said, these alternatives to peat, because peat is a carbon sink and it's a home to rare and threatened species. But if we can do this environmentally and sustainably, then this is a wonderful thing. But if you still don't like utilizing peat, you're concerned about the cost and whatnot, we want to talk about exploring some of the other things that you might be interested in. And this is coming from some of the research that I've been doing with compost lately. Um, we know um, we know that we're trying very hard to get rid of a lot of the waste that's going to landfills. And particularly down where I am, which is in Broward County, there are some serious issues in Miami-Dade, Broward, where we need to start finding another way to get rid of our waste, food waste, landscape waste, whatnot. I don't think I need to tell anybody on here about this or expound upon this. So we are looking at different compost. You can see here on the left, that's coming from one of the mushroom composts that we work with. And then on the right, this is landscape food waste and CNAF waste that we have composted, or one of our partners did. I love compost. I think it's great. Um, but it's a hard sell for my growers, and I completely understand why. After all the research I've done with it, it can really be a hit and miss. But we have come a long way, and I am so proud that we've come this way from 20 years ago to where we were pulling out like needles and gross stuff out of compost, and we're like, why are we using this? To to these wonderful processes that have just come about in recent years. But compost, yes, it's absolutely sustainable. But there are a variety of problems with it. And why my growers have a hard time utilizing this is because of the consistency. Um, it has to always be a consistent product so that they can maintain their fertilizing, their watering practices, and they don't have to always, be bouncing around wondering what's going on with their plants. So one of the issues I've seen just, in the work that we've done recently is the pHs have fluctuated or ranged from 4 all the way up to 9. We've gotten some substrate pHs as high as 9. The salinity goes back to your electrical conductivity or your EC, which we discussed. We do not want to have high salinity, and some of these composts are coming back very high in salts. So which would be sodium. And what's interesting for me is typically what I have seen is that food waste that is used in composting tends to be very high in sodium. And so what have they been telling us, everybody, for about restaurant foods, and particularly we're utilizing restaurant food, but um, it's high in sodium, right? So that's something to think about if you're contemplating using food waste. It can be full of heavy metals. We know that some of the sargassum that they're pulling from the oceans, it's wonderful. I like the idea of it. And when it's composted, it can be high in arsenic, cadmium, chromium, and lead, but that tends to be the case where it's around places like Florida, where we do have some industrial processes in the state of Florida. But I understand that sargassum that has been utilized elsewhere in the world is not full of those heavy metals. But again, uh, compost in itself can be full of heavy metals. PFAS are pesticides. They can have all these forever chemicals in them. So that's something that I know a lot of people shy away from. They also have a tendency to leach nutrients. And I have spoken to a number of people in the industry, and um, I haven't seen, nor have I worked with a material that doesn't leach nutrients. Um, so that's a big one for us here in the state of Florida in terms of if you're going to amend your soils and sandy soils, and you're going to be putting these compost on sand soils, you have to keep in mind that if it is high in nitrogen and nitrates, ammonium, we want to keep in mind that that's going to be leaching potentially down to groundwater and affecting some of our waterways. Same with phosphorus. And I've heard this repeated throughout the industry that this is not the case, but yet I get soil reports and I see that when we conduct leachate studies. Um, so something to definitely keep in mind, have your compost tested. The other thing I want everybody to take a look at when you're using compost is the wettability, or the ability of your compost to accept water. We call this wettability or water repellency. So when you're using compost, and I'd love to hear this from our master gardener volunteers, when they're using compost, for those of you who do, and it dries down, how quickly does your compost re-wet or accept that water that you're irrigating with? Because it is organic matter, we know that there are organic acids in there. And when that dries down, they have a tendency to be very water repellent. So in the peat industry, they treat about 90% of the peat is treated with something that will help re-wet it or wet it up. And I think that's something, if you're utilizing compost, you need to keep in the back of your head. Compost can be, it's local, it can be economical, and of course, there are a variety of sources, hence the reason the problem with consistency. We do have a number of people who are composting throughout the state, and I know they are working on the consistency as well, and we are starting to see, yes, we're maybe some growers are moving more towards the use of compost, but these are just some of the issues that we have with compost. Some and you know, and yes, I think that most of them can be overcome. So this is my graduate student Naomi's research project, and she's phenomenal. She's doing a great job. But she was looking at canaf, which if many of you have seen me give the talk on canaf, which is a hibiscus cannabinus. And we were looking at canaf, not grinding it and using it like it's been done before for horticultural substrates, but rather as a compost amendment. So what Naomi did is we grew this compost, and then or we grew the canaf up in Citra, and then we composted it. And she had a number of treatments. One where she just turned it and she didn't do anything else to the canaf, and then another one where she added black cow, which is also another Florida company. So we added black cow at different rates and composted it, and then to have the sustainable substrate. And this is, I'm just going to touch on this because this is really Naomi's story to tell, and I know she's excited about it. But we do see, if you just look at these graphs, and on the first one where you see percent green canopy, trial 1 is in the dark green, trial 2 is in the light green, and on the left is your percent green canopy, which we want to see a higher number on that. So the first 3 products are the bottom, but the first 3 are canaf-based products. And we see where the canaf just by itself has a phenomenal green canopy. But on the bottom, those are all different types of compost. And you can see the variability within all the compost. And you can see the variability between trial 1 and trial 2. So a lot of variability there. To the right, you can see at the bottom is Canadian peat, the CMP, and Dakota peat. And what was interesting about that is the Canadian peat did not do well, which is the sphagnum peat moss based, and then the Dakota peat did very well towards the end of the trial. So again, the variability is just crazy. On the right-hand side, you see it's the same treatments, just a bunch of different composts, but this is just looking at arugula seeds and the proportion that emerge, and the variability in some of those treatments are extremely high between trial 1 and trial 2, and that is definitely not what we want to see. Surprisingly, Dakota peat, the DKP at the top, you can see between trial 1 and trial 2 in the blue and the red, the proportion of arugula seeds that emerged was almost the same, which is great, but a lot of variability between my other compost treatment. So that's definitely not what a grower wants to see over time, and it is definitely an issue, but phytotoxicity was really not that bad. And again, she was also looking at, that was a seedling study, and now she's looking at it for transplant success, where we took liner plants, vinca liner plants, and we transferred them into compost to see how they fared. And again, there were a lot of differences in between different composts, the peat substrates just by themselves. But for this particular trial, we went ahead and we mixed the compost with pine bark because this is going to be outside. And we know that a lot of our growers look at pine bark, put pine bark in their container plants outside to, particularly if they're using compost, to prevent subsidence. And you can see here that she was getting some great results. On the right-hand side, interesting enough, is, and I love this photo. On the right-hand side is leachate study. And what we did is we took these PVC columns and we put in about 6 inches of sand. And I shouldn't say we, she did this. I was just monitoring. So 6 inches of sand, and then we had about, I guess, 2 inches of compost. Look at the variability within the treatments. Look at the differences between the colors and those leachates. We also had a sand treatment, which is on your left, but look at what Naomi is seeing visually, and you can definitely tell where she's getting some differences. So we are, like I said, leaching nitrogen. We are leaching phosphorus and some other things as well. So something to think about. And this is something we did because we knew that in Florida, when you have all this sand and you want to go ahead and amend or put compost on top of that to help plants establish, makes complete sense to me. But you have to keep in mind that I believe that is an 8-inch root zone. So that 8-inch root zone, you're still leaching a lot of material through there. So uh, it, I love the idea of compost, but the variability is still an issue. So biochar, um, I know a lot of groups here in the state are very interested in getting rid of biochar. They are looking for a means to find some growers and to find particularly farmers to put it out on their land. What is biochar? It's a highly porous carbon and very stable organic biomass that was basically combusted in the presence of limited oxygen. So the process is pyrolysis, and we know that biochar can be awesome. I've seen some wonderful things with biochar. However, again, we get back to the same thing with compost, the consistency. Also, biochar can be very expensive. But I think we're coming to a point where some of these groups have the means to make biochar, and now they just have to have a way to get rid of it so they can continue. I have a group up in Jacksonville, they can compost and they can do biochar, but they're making it, but they just can't get rid of it. So um, if you're using biochar, you're going to notice that there are physical and chemical properties that need to be adjusted because of the inconsistency. And if you're cooking that material, the organic waste, if you're heating that up to 400 degrees, what you get at 400 degrees can be very different from what you get at 1,000. So that's why biochar is kind of all over the place still. And um, if you can find an area that is, or a company that does it consistently all the time, they have the same product, then that's where the key to biochar, I think, is. It is nutrient holding, water holding, but again, yes, and we've seen where you can increase the microbial activities, which is wonderful. However, it depends on what you're using for biochar, where it's coming from. Same issues with compost. The pH range from biochar is very large. I've seen it as low as 3 all the way up to 11. And again, it depends on your feedstock and the temperature that you're cooking it at. So I agree with biochar, but you really have to have the patience to work with it, find your consistent source, and look at it as a means to, hey, it's a very stable material going back into the soil. I love the idea of it. But again, you just have to know where you're getting it from. Wood pine bark is, oh my goodness, wood pine bark is very, very popular. This is a sustainable method. They were originally, when we first started looking at wood or pine bark, they were looking at it as a means to substitute for perlite. It's great. We know that we source generally, it's loblolly pine. It's widely cultivated all over the Southeast. I like the fact that we can locally source it. Again, not all these wood products are the same. So when you're playing with it and you got a great response from a bag of pine bark that you bought that was from company XYZ, you always have to keep in mind that you should stick with that company, or you should always know that the companies vary greatly in how it's cut, the tree that it can be derived from, as well as how they are uh, creating the pine bark in itself. So, or shaving it off the tree. So it tends to have a high pH, which I know a lot of my growers don't like, and you do have to make changes to your irrigation practices. But it's really developed, and we've come a long way. And when we first started doing this in the early 2000s, now we have the means to make different ratios of air to water properties and different drainage properties. So it's very I like the wood and pine bark. It is mostly used in the outside container production. Some of my growers are using compost and this wood and pine bark and mixing that at a 60/40, and they're loving it because it does reduce some of the subsidence that they see with compost. Rice hulls. I don't know too many of my growers who have gone this way. We do have a source that could be utilized, but the rice hulls, it's a protective covering that's found on the rice. Typically, the pH is between 6 and 8. But a lot of people, again, if we can increase it up to an undesirable level, and my growers don't like that, it can be high in silicon, um, which isn't a bad thing. It means it hangs around for a while, which is good. It can increase your potassium and your phosphorus. It is very consistent, which is a good thing. And where we have found it to be very beneficial is work that was done by Altland in 2019. He's found that it was good for weed control, particularly in container plants. That weed control specifically liverwort and bittercress. But we also know that rice hulls in itself, they can reduce. Some crops just don't like it. Some container plants just don't like the rice hulls. So like Lee found that they reduce the growth of pepper seedlings. So something that we absolutely want to consider when using rice hulls. Like I said, a substitute for perlite. And of course, last but not least, core. I know a lot of my growers use this, produced in tropical areas. Like I said, there's not a fair trade, or there are some issues with human rights around the world. I know a lot of my growers are now starting to source from South America. It is a sustainable industry byproduct. Initially, when we started using core, it was very high in salts or electrical conductivity, but actually it was the sodium because they were using salt water um, uh, to make the core. But now we have found I've had some lovely core, and they've changed their practices a little bit. So the issue with core though is the cost, because we are shipping it. So again, sustainable, but you're running into the cost and transportation. So just going back and wrapping this up, and we can skip here to the answers. Keep this in the back of your head that some European countries are planning to ban the sale of peat. This is absolutely true. Ireland has already done it, and we know that England and some of the European countries are moving to do that, and they were supposed to have done it last year. So definitely true. Peat extraction contributes over 1 billion metric tons of climate changing carbon dioxide emissions per year. This is false. Around the world, peat has been collected in large quantities and sold for gardening and used as fuel. This is true. And peat extraction permanently destroys peatlands. This is a very big false statement. If you take nothing else away from my talk, just keep this in the back of the mind. We have found a method to do this sustainably, and I think it makes a world of difference. And yes, there are many options that are available in terms of alternatives, offering similar characteristics to peat with much less impacts. That is not true. Peat is in its own subclass. But what we're trying to get everybody to do is, of course, use peat as an extender on top of something else, whether you're mixing peat with core or perlite or whatnot. It should be used as a part of your amendment or part of your substrate. Okay, I'm going to skip through that for another time. And if you're all sitting there, it would be extremely helpful. I'm very grateful if you guys could take your phones, take a picture of this, and just a few questions on landscape water use. And it is different from the one that Kim put out we realized it was too long for everybody. So now we're doing a different water study or water use survey. So if you could take that, and if there's that many people, Kim would love me and it'd be very helpful. But I will take any questions you have now. And always remember, you can contact me if you disagree with anything I said, or you want to discuss it, or you have any more questions. That's my email address. Wendy, any
Oh
questions?
boy, we've got some fun questions from Lisa, and I'm going to ask you to some of them I'll let you answer quick and some I want you to unpack, but this is a question. With the government tariffs perhaps impending, do you think that that will impact the peat and that will make things unaffordable for our growers?
So really good question. And if you have been at TPIE, maybe you were, Lisa, this was like the numero uno question that everybody we were all chatting about it. I don't know. And I guess we're going to wait to see. I don't think anybody knows.
Yeah. Jeff Blakely wants to remind us that sometimes ancient human remains are found in peat bogs in Europe.
Yes.
So never know when we're going to find a mastodon or a ancient
Yeah.
human.
Yeah, that is
Um,
true.
Then Yvonne in Indian River is asking, is carbon released when we use peat in our potting media? It's not composting, what's she's thinking about peat burning off and
Yeah.
that
So
concept there.
and that's a great question. So I got in a discussion with Stephanie and Asha yesterday, and uh, they the CSBMA is doing research on that right now. How much carbon is lost when you're transferring from the peatland and we're bringing it down here to Florida and you're planting it and then you're putting it back in the soil?
Mhm.
They are doing research on that right now. We don't know. There were some numbers that were out there that they believe are false. I cannot speak on that right now, but I hope that well, I know we can get the research from them and they are looking into that. But it's a great question. We don't know.
Well, Yvonne, follow up with Micah. She'll be around and you'll be around for a few years. So see where we're doing with the research on that. Flora, which is a great name for a master gardener, by the way, she's saying when we say that peat or perlite may help prevent diseases, are we talking about root diseases, crown diseases? What kind of diseases did you mean when you said that?
I mean diseases like root-borne diseases.
Okay.
And the reason why I say that is here's a couple things with that, Flora, which is a great name. So a couple things is one, the drainage. So we're not sitting in a sopping mess. Number one complaint, right, with my growers. And so that if it's drained and it has a nice air-filled porosity, that means that diseases don't tend to flourish, right? So also when they irrigate, they like to see peat and their substrates. They like to see where they can actually dry down and they don't remain wet. So that's why irrigation is such a critical part. So it is basically the root-borne diseases, and with the peat, it has to do with the drainage and porosity, but also it's with a microbial action, and there's some other things going on in there. And they think pH might also play a very big role in that as well, Flora.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then Diane is wondering about getting your compost tested. Should that go to the extension testing lab? Do you have a recommendation if someone wanted to get their compost tested? I'm assuming for pH, CEC, EC, and sodium, etc.
Yes. So we are working right now. We do have a new I don't know, Wendy, what is his name? He's new at the University of Florida.
Yeah.
You can't,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, off the top of my head, if you could find that. So we have somebody new at the University of Florida, and we are trying to open up this discussion with doing compost testing specifically for doing soil testing specifically for compost, because it is a different process. So we send our material. You can send it to the University of Florida, but also you could send it out to Waypoint. There are a lot of, if you go on USCC, which is United States Compost Council, there is a lot of different compost testing sites and that you could look into as well. But yes, you can send it to the University of Florida. I send it for
His
research.
name is Fronta Moss.
Yes, that is his name.
Mhm.
And he is actually giving a talk, I think. Anyways, I digress. Yes, you can send it to the University of Florida for research purposes. We send it to a compost testing lab, and it's extremely expensive. And I don't think you need to go to that. Just for the basics, send it to UF or send it to Waypoint, or any soil. Werner Turf is another one. There's a bunch of different labs that you can send it there, and just let them know that it's compost.
Right, you want that organic matter or the compost test. Otherwise, they'll do something else and it won't be worth your time or money. Okay. Janice in Volusia is saying, this is more of a comment. Her compost is completely inconsistent and is a combination of everything and, from kitchen scraps to yard waste, etc. And that she puts it around the yard, as much as possible. And then Mark is saying, is livestock grazing promoted as an alternative, Pete? Just the manure going on, I think that's probably like in place compost if you leave the manure, but I also know that dung beetles go ahead and move through that manure pretty quickly.
So what's his question? Is that
Is livestock grazing promoted as an alternative, Pete, is the exact question.
I just know from for compost, we are utilizing definitely some materials like the uh, poultry waste, beef waste or beef cattle waste, and um, and different biosolids. As I think that's where he's going.
Yeah.
I tend to stick preferably to, I use Black Cow. I do like Black Cow. And there are other ones out there as well. But I tend to stick to like the previous person was saying, I tend to stick to food waste and and the Black Cow, and I have some other things that I throw. Yes, mine's all over the place and inconsistent too, but I still use it. You just have to understand that when you're using it and your plants aren't thriving, and Wendy is training everybody to say, okay, that's a nitrogen deficiency. This is what's going on. You can see what's going on with your compost, and you can take care of it without pouring on a ton of fertilizer or killing your plants. I'm not for sure what he was asking with that question, but
That's okay.
yes, we do use different biosolids for compost. That is correct.
Yeah. Good. And Nancy uses composted cow manure all the time in the garden, blends it with peat so it isn't hot. She's also been planting her plant waste around the garden.
Yeah, that's good.
And she says, I'm sure it will be relatively hot. Oh, could she use pine straw to kind of cool it down? I think that's true, but
So I always ask when we do a compost talk, Dr. Moore and I, and everybody always wants to know what their C to N ratios are. And you should know if you're using compost, you should know what your C to N ratios. That to me is the number one thing you should know for your compost, followed by the EC and the pH. So those are the big ones for me. But your C to N ratio should be between 20 and 30. And you will definitely know if your compost is too hot because you won't get anything to grow in it.
So when we talk about C to N in Master Gardener Training, we usually talk about browns to greens.
Oh, okay,
So,
carbon to
right,
nitrogen, yeah.
carbon to
So
nitrogen
browns
or
to
browns
greens.
to greens. And so she's saying for 1 part green, you should have 20 part brown.
1 part green. I want to say to everybody that I can't subscribe. Yes, you're right. But my comment is I know a lot of people are using browns, and you define it as browns, but for me, um, like these carbon sources can differ, like 50 to 1. For instance, CNAF is 110 to 1. And then I'll get another source of your browns and it's 50 to 1.
Okay.
So I like to take this, and you can see when it's starting to break down that you just know to when it starts to break down and starts to get too hot, then yeah, go ahead and start adding in some of your browns, and then you can go back or adding in some of your carbon. But with I can't always tell when people email me and say, hey, uh, what does this look like? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what the C to N
It
ratio is.
looks like compost.
Yeah, yeah. But they asked me to look at it, and I can't. I have seen compost that was stunning. It was like some of the best compost I've ever looked at, and the C to N ratio was like 13 to 1. And then I saw another one, it was 60 to 1. You have to send that off to a soil testing lab to have them look at that. And I can't tell you
Okay.
you know, how to evaluate it visually to say, hey, I just know if it's too hot, then you're going to burn something up. So, you know, to take it down a little bit.
So, Julia asked, she says she doesn't really like using compost because it dries out very hard. Does this harm the plant? And so I think you probably have a good answer for that.
Yeah. So, this is, and Julie, this is exactly. And for if you guys are starting to notice this, I would love to hear that. Because we have not ever started to evaluate compost for water repellency. And if it's drying out and you can't re-wet it, then that means that your soils have a lot of organic acids in there, and those organic acids create a very hydrophobic, meaning it doesn't accept water. So water will run off and it will not hydrophilize around your plants and your plants will die. Same thing with peat, you guys. So if the peat doesn't have a surfactant on it, and you'll know from the bag, it will say something, it will say a wetting agent. If it doesn't have a wetting agent in there, your peat can dry down and then you just can't re-wet it. So it's something that I'm going to continue to explore. We're writing some EDIS documents on it, and I can direct you to those EDIS documents.
Good. We'll stay tuned for that. Janice is wondering for biochar, what are they burning to get the biochar?
Oh, good question, Janice. So my group up in Jacksonville, that's why they came to me, is because they're actually burning palms.
Oh,
So, but I've heard everything. It could be any organic waste, wine, trees, grasses, um, uh, uh, just anything, any organic waste. You can burn it, and depending on what temperature they cook it at, is how they get that biochar.
okay. I think we probably are going to need, in the future, we're going to need a whole presentation on biochar. What changes do you need to make in irrigation when using pine bark rather than perlite? Do you?
Okay, so that's a really good question. If you are going to be utilizing pine bark or instead of perlite, I have seen it go both ways, but for me, pine bark, you maybe need to step it up a little bit, and increase your watering practices uh, in your container. If you have them outside in your container plants, you would increase your irrigation. That's what I have seen. What some of the literature says. Uh, I think I've seen one or two pieces of literature where they actually reduced it, but the pine bark was in a smaller particle size. So
Okay.
it all depends on how big your pine bark is, and this goes for all wood substrates. What the particle size is, um, and you can tell whether it can wet up or dry down. So I tend to see where you have to increase it just a little bit.
Okay. What's the name of the company in Jacksonville that's selling the biochar?
It's Sunshine Organics.
Okay. Leslie, I think you know where Sunshine Organics is.
And
All
remember,
right.
these are very big. They're they're a big composting group up there. They do an amazing thing. They take a ton of waste from big companies, and um they are very interested in research and everything else. But they wrote a grant and got a grant from USDA for a big uh basically the machine to make biochar, the pyrolysis. I can't remember the name of it, but anyways, the machine to make biochar, and they would like to start selling it and getting it out there to everybody. Because remember, when they take in that waste and they move it and they compost it, now they got nowhere to send it. So that's why they need people to say, "Hey, I want to use compost and I want to use biochar." Um, and I do know, I know that they just got the machine not too long ago, but that was their goal, was to start using palm trees for making the biochar. And they're very interested in, and you can find biochar in the box stores. You can find them at your nurseries. But they're very interested in big volume because they got to move a ton of material. So keep that in mind too.
Okay. Um, and somebody's wanting to know about the release of, when they harvest the peat, does that release CO2?
Yeah, so right now, that is, they are doing a very in-depth study up in Canada about, and they have brought in more people to look at global warming and the greenhouse gases and the
Okay.
greenhouse gas emissions. So there's more to come on that, and we should what I'll do is I'll send it to Wendy, and there's a website that you can go to where they go through the whole process, and they have some numbers. There was also a presentation that was given by James Altland, Altland, from the USDA, and he talks a lot about peat and peat restoration. Um, but I will get Wendy these websites, and you guys can take a look at the research that they're doing, so we have the answers to these questions.
Okay, and when you do that, do me a favor and send me a link to the survey. Someone was having trouble, not that it was a problem, I was able to open it, but with the QR code, so we
Okay.
can.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you guys. Really appreciate it.
Sure. And I think the ban of peat in Ireland is because of the non-sustainability belief that is out there, right?
Yeah, and for Ireland, it's a psychological thing too. There are people who are raised in peat burning homes in Ireland. And they will tell you they've been doing this process for thousands of years. Their families have done this, and um, it's really a big issue there. But they did ban it. I do believe they had to reopen it because they needed to start sourcing more peat to grow for the horticultural substrates. So yeah.
Okay, and what about worm castings as peat alternative or in production blends?
So I haven't done any work with the worm castings. I have heard some wonderful things. I have read some wonderful things about worm castings. Uh, the and I have we I believe in it. I know the research backs it up, but I have not done any work with that. And you have to think, I'm looking at it more from a commercial horticulture standpoint where we need these big volumes. So I think there are certain places that you can utilize that, but I have not personally looked at it.
Okay, where do most people buy rice hulls?
I know people have been buying it. Well, for master gardeners, I know Amazon sells rice holes.
Okay,
And
good.
I do believe I saw some in Home Depot. Can I say that, Wendy? Or the back
You can say the
stores?
big orange one or the big blue one is what we say.
They both of them. I've
Okay.
seen them there. But um, I will say too that I've for the rice holes, they were using it to control weeds.
Mhm.
And the thing you have to remember with rice holes is when you do a nice layer or on the top, they're kind of using it as a mulch to control weeds, and it did work. Um,
How does that
but
affect the germination of other things? Like if you're trying to germinate seedlings, is that where you're going?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. But also it can sometimes be very hydrophobic, meaning that it won't let the water go into. You had to be careful with how much you mulch with the rice holes because
Okay.
water won't go into the container.
But it
So
could have some inhibition for seedlings, right?
yes, yes.
Okay, Greg, there's
Well,
your
which
answer
is
there.
that's why you don't plant the seedlings in it.
Yep.
The pepper seedlings. What was that the one I was talking about? It's it has been shown to reduce weed seedlings, right? So the weeds won't germinate with the rice holes, right? But I would not plant seed if you're looking to use rice holes for seed germination. That's not a good idea.
Yeah. Okay. And Jenny asked about loblolly pine forests that are used for pine bark. Is there a problem with that as cypress? Jenny, I'll just say that the planting of pines is a huge industry in Florida, and that pine bark is a byproduct of the pine industry as opposed to the cypress, which is they're chopping them up just for cypress in many occasions, not all, but some.
So it's a sustainable practice.
Right. And then, so Leslie is asking about some of the peat is extracted from deep deposits that are 100 years old, and she's like, how is that not a problem hurting the
So
peat?
um and listen, Leslie, I think the number of peat organizations or peat processors were 88% is where they were Veriflora and sustainably certified. the process that they're using too, though, is just looking at scraping off like the top. And so that's a really great question, because some of the performances that you see for peat, some of it's scraped from the top, and some of it is scraped from deeper. And that's why we're just kind of saying, start looking for that Veriflora and, that sustainable
Okay.
kingfisher, because we want to make sure that you are sourcing it from a group that is sustainably sustainable for sure.
Are commercial compost tested for PFAS? So if we're out there buying composted material, has it been tested for PFAS?
I'm sure for us, we are not, that's a whole nother test that we have to run, and it's expensive. I do know that there is a graduate student who's looking at PFAS and compost in the state of Florida.
Okay.
I'll get you her information. She might have published by now, but with the PFAS, that should, I want to say universally, I don't think it is, but there may be some companies that are doing that. I think there are some that do and some that don't.
Okay, so PFAS are these long-lasting polyfluoroalkyl
Alcohol, yeah.
substances that are persistent in a lot of things in our environment, and we're worried about it being a detriment to our health.
Yes.
I think that would be a really cool master gardener experiment to take different composted materials that are retailly available, and for them to run the test on it. That would be kind of cool.
Yeah,
Uh,
and the other one too, I think they're looking at is microplastics as well.
yeah, yeah. Um, so good. Let's see. Rose Larkin sent a compost sample to IFAS for testing, and she was very pleased with the results. So that's good to
Good.
hear.
Good.
Considering pesticides and plastics, what are our major concerns when we use our homemade compost? How to avoid and minimize? Um, I'll let you field that one, Micah.
So for me, I, I'm using like food waste, and I I know that uh, what I'm putting into I know exactly what's in it, right? I'm not taking material that somebody else has composted for me, which we're trying to move towards that, right? Where we're utilizing other compost. Um, how you can tell is you could test it yourself and send it in and have IFAS take a look at it. But these are starting to get very expensive. Okay. So I tend to look at how the plants are doing in it. There are a lot of plants that just won't grow. For instance, if um, with PFAS, it can be such a minute amount that we wouldn't even maybe be able to pick it up or see it in a plant. Same goes with the microplastics. It doesn't seem to deter plants that much. And with the heavy metals, um, we are actually working on a project to see if we can use other plants to phytoremediate heavy metals out of compost so that it could be utilized without that fear, or at least taken down to where the plants aren't dying from it.
Good.
So we know heavy metals are an issue, definitely. But with the PFAS, they're still learning so much about it, so I can't really speak on it. And I do know there's another professor working on it
Okay.
out
Good.
of the vet school.
Okay, we'll stay tuned for that.
Yeah.
Debbie is wanting to know best compost and mulch for her citrus trees. Debbie has a rule, we don't really recommending mulch around citrus trees because of the foot rot diseases and the root rot diseases. So, but Micah, what do you talk about for compost? As far as nutrients, they have such high nitrogen and needs. I'm wondering if compost would even be enough.
Yeah, so I always like to with citrus, yes, I absolutely, I think you can use compost. I do myself. It seems to be doing pretty well, but I also fertilize. Um,
Okay.
they I would absolutely recommend utilizing the fertilizer. And I think with some of the results that we're getting, you guys, from our research here is, yes, we do believe that we're leaching some of the, we don't know if it's plant available, but we still would make a recommendation to use a slow release fertilizer. And you as master gardeners would be able to see, okay, I can see that my plant is starting to yellow, and I need to start putting on some Osmocote, because I've heard this religiously, and I'm actually going to the compost the compost sortium or compost counseling out in Phoenix. And talk every year I've been to this conference is we fail to say um, at time, but if you're using the compost, you keep an eye, because it's not the end be all. You still have to maintain to
Oh,
use some
Micah,
type.
I'm losing your audio, unfortunately. You're freezing.
So sorry, it's Fort Lauderdale.
Okay.
Can you hear me now, Wendy?
Yeah, I think it's correcting.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that I think that we always keep in mind, I think compost is a wonderful thing. I do still think that you will need to continue to fertilize using a slow release fertilizer. And
Okay.
you will, as master gardeners, you can tell when your plants, I use a slow release fertilizer, and, and I can tell when my plants are yellow, that compost is tying up some of those nutrients. So that is, I think, one of the things that we don't widely know right now is, and one of the things I think is a misconception, that if you use compost, you don't have to fertilize. I have not seen that to be the case.
Yeah, not in Florida. Not in Florida.
No.
Let's see. Somebody is asking about, oh, there's two more I want to focus on. We got to let you go. You've got important research and students to supervise and all kinds of stuff to do, Micah. So, Yvonne is asking about chop and drop method of mulching and composting, like through permaculture, like the Brazilian sunflowers, India edulis. And I have two questions about this, about is canaf ever chopped and dropped?
Yes. Um, I don't know who just stole my research idea, but we are actually looking at plants. Somebody took it. No, we are looking at, and I'll tell you why. Yes, that's a really great question, and I'm very excited to explore this, because that the I believe it was the Mexican sunflower,
Uh-huh.
and yes, we are looking at canaf as a means to chop and drop. Why am I particularly interested in it? Because we have found that canaf in itself is full of potassium, magnesium, and manganese.
Oh,
And what does that fit, you guys? It fits a palm nutrition.
palms, yes.
We're very excited, but also I was
Oh, she's really
club.
frozen now. Okay, good.
Um,
It's okay. We didn't hear that last thought that you were really excited about.
so we're just exploring different means to chop and drop, so that our plant waste isn't going to and different ways to enhance chop and drop.
Okay.
So yes, I believe in that. I believe that they're doing a lot of work in Africa for it. But we are excited because we're not only are we looking at plants these to mediate, but we'd like to see that as an alternative, just chop, put it back in the soil, and go from there. That would
Okay.
be ideal, wouldn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think so. Well, I think, Micah, we've kept you 22 minutes over. Everybody does have great questions in here. And there is, someone wanted to remind me that there's a great tutorial for composting from the Sarasota website, and it really is a great one. I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat if anybody wants to grab that. And just a couple more quick questions if I can trouble you. What is a good one for a good seed starting mix? What do you recommend for that?
I know that the ones in the box uh, were great. We use Pro Mix. That's to have for us.
Okay,
So, and
great.
it's relatively inexpensive for us, because remember, so we need to save money. But So we use a pro mix, and we are working on different types of peat as well for seed starters. But for right now, what we use is pro mix.
Okay, and then Sandy asked, does coir have the same problem with drying down as peat?
I have not, Sandy, that's a really good question.
Okay,
If you are using research trial, we compared plastic containers to the new cloth bags or grow bags, and we are carrying it, and we found that core a good job if you use those cloth grow bags and maintain the moisture in those cloth grow bags. But there's more. I think it, but it does maintain that moisture.
good,
What we've
good.
seen so far, yes, that is correct.
All right, well, so many great ideas coming out of your lab. We're very excited. I'm excited to see Naomi's research go forward. That sounds really cool. And of course, we're gonna Mica has just agreed to rewrite the Palm chapter of the Master Gardener Training Manual. She was coerced earlier this hour, so we're so happy for that. So stay tuned for all of
True,
that.
Wendy.
All right, Master Gardeners, thank you so much for hanging in there with us, and we'll see you next month for the webinar. We're going to be learning about ecology and stumps in your yard. So, Micah, come on back for that if you're interested.
Absolutely. Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. We'll see you guys later. Thank you,
All right,
everybody.
thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.